Welcome to the deep dive. We take a big subject, look at all the angles, all the sources, and try to figure out what you really need to know. And today, well, the subject is about as big as it gets. William Shakespeare.
Uh-huh. It's a monumental task, really.
Universally seen as, the greatest writer in the English language, the preeminent dramatist, sometimes just the bard.
Exactly. And when you dig into the sources, you're not just looking at a writer. You're looking at this cultural force, his legacy. It's over 4 centuries old. And the number of books sold, estimates put it over 4 billion copies worldwide. It's staggering. He's foundational, really, for modern Western literature.
So our mission today isn't just to celebrate the works, though we will, the 39 plays, 154 sonnet, those long poems, but we also want to really examine the life, the career, the documented facts, and, the controversies that still swirl around the man himself rigorously.
And that's where it gets interesting and maybe a bit challenging for you if you want to be really informed, because the actual historical record for his personal life, it's surprisingly thin in places.
Yeah, and that lack of hard evidence, paradoxically, has fueled just as much fascination as his actual genius. You see it in all the questions about his lost years, what he actually believed religiously, and even debates about the texts themselves. How accurate are the versions we read today?
So we're diving into the solid facts, what we can document, but also exploring the most plausible ideas that spring from those gaps.
Exactly. Documented fact and informed speculation.
Okay, let's start with the foundations, where he came from. Stratford-upon-Avon, Warwickshire. What was his family standing? What was life like there?
Well, Stratford was a pretty standard English market town, and the Shakespeares, they were relatively well off, certainly comfortable, though definitely not nobility. His father, John Shakespeare, was a successful glover, made gloves, purses, that sort of leather work. But he was also a prominent figure in the town.
Right, an alderman, yes, and eventually bailiff, which was basically the mayor, so respected. His mother, Mary Arden, she came from a slightly higher social standing, an old, affluent, landowning family. Local gentry, really.
So that background gave young William maybe a leg up, access to things others might not have had.
Definitely. Access to education, for one, and a certain social standing within Stratford. It wasn't the background you might typically associate with an actor or playwright later on, which were often seen as less reputable professions.
And the dates.
Yeah.
We always hear that striking detail. Born and died on the same day. How solid is that?
Well, we know he was baptized on April 26, 1564. That's in the parish records. The birth certificate doesn't exist. So traditionally, biographers settle on April 23rd. It's St. George's Day, England's patron saint, so it has that nice symbolic ring to it.
Ah, okay.
And then, yes, the coincidence is that he also died on April 23rd in 1616, making him exactly 52.
Yeah.
It gives his life this neat, almost literary symmetry.
Now, his education. This is a point skeptics sometimes jump on, the lack of attendance records. But scholars seem pretty sure he went to the local grammar school.
Yes, the consensus is very strong that he attended the King's New School, right there in Stratford. The lack of records isn't that unusual for the period, but what we do know is what the curriculum was like in these Elizabethan grammar schools, and it was intense, much more rigorous than, say, high school today.
How so?
The focus was almost entirely on Latin, reading classical authors in the original Latin, writing in Latin, even speaking Latin. He would have been immersed from a young age in writers like Seneca, Ovid, Terence, Plautus.
So when he later writes these incredibly powerful Roman plays or draws on classical mythology...
It's not secondhand knowledge. He wasn't just reading translations. This stuff was drilled into him. The structures of classical rhetoric, the models of Roman drama and comedy, that was his foundational training.
That makes sense. It really grounds his later skill.
Absolutely. That classical education is the bedrock. You see it everywhere, from the formal arguments and the tragedies to the quick, witty wordplay in the comedies. It's all built on that rhetorical training.
Okay, so he has this solid education, a respectable family, but then his personal life seems to kick off with a bit of drama, or at least haste.
That's how it looks, certainly. In November 1582, he marries Anne Hathaway. He's only 18. She's 26.
8 years older. And the wedding seems rushed.
Yes. Normally, the marriage bans, the public announcement in church, had to be read out on 3 consecutive Sundays. But in their case, a special license was obtained from the Bishop of Worcester's court to allow the marriage after just 1 reading.
Which usually implies
urgency. And the reason became clear about 6 months later.
their first child.
Exactly. Their daughter, Susanna, was baptized at the end of May 1583. So the timeline points very strongly towards a premarital pregnancy necessitating the marriage. Not scandalous, perhaps, for the time, but certainly quick.
And then more children followed.
Yes. Almost 2 years later, they had twins, baptized in February 1585, a son, Hamlet, and another daughter, Judith.
Hamnet, his only son. And he died young, didn't he?
Tragically, yes. Hamlet died in the summer of 1596 when he was just 11 years old. It's a biographical detail that looms large for many scholars.
Because of the timing. And the name, obviously, Hamlet.
Precisely. We don't have Shakespeare's diary, of course, no letters saying, "I'm grieving." But the loss of his male heir happens just before he enters that period of writing the great dark tragedies. And the similarity between Hamlet and Hamlet, it's impossible to ignore. Many critics feel that personal grief, that trauma, must have informed the depth of introspection, the focus on mortality and loss that you see in Hamlet.
It's compelling even if we can't prove it directly.
It is. It adds a layer of human reality to the artistic shift.
Okay, so the twins are born in 85. He's married, has a family in Stratford. But then between 1585 and his first real mention as a writer in London in 1592, silence. The lost years. If you wanted to get up to speed on this period, what are the main stories or theories you'd encounter?
Right, the lost years. It's fertile ground for speculation. You generally hear three main narratives, none with much hard proof. The most famous, probably, comes from his first proper biographer, Nicholas Rowe, writing in the early 1700s. Rowe tells this story about Shakespeare having to flee Stratford for London.
Why?
Because he got caught poaching deer from the estate of a local bigwig, Sir Thomas Lucy. It's a dramatic tale, young rebel on the run, forced to seek his fortune in the big city.
Classic origin story stuff, but likely just a story.
Probably. It fits a narrative need, but there's no court record, no contemporary mention. It surfaces much later.
Okay, what's alternative number 2?
Another 18th century story, this one from John Aubrey, is much less glamorous. It suggests Shakespeare got his start in London literally holding horses for wealthy theatergoers outside the playhouses.
A much humbler beginning.
Yeah, positions him as starting right at the bottom rung of the theater world. Again, no real proof, just anecdotal tradition.
And the third main theory is a bit more academic. The schoolmaster idea.
Right. This theory gained traction in the 20th century.
Right.
It suggests he might have spent some of those years working as a schoolmaster, possibly in the countryside, maybe even for a Catholic family.
Why Catholic?
Because wealthy Catholic families sometimes employed private tutors, mistrusting the official Protestant state schools. There's some circumstantial evidence linking a William Shakespeare, possibly a variant spelling or a relative to Catholic households in Lancashire, like the Houghton family.
But again, it's not a slam dunk.
Not at all. It's based on hearsay, regional connections, wills mentioning players.
Mm-hmm.
It's suggestive, especially given the later debates about his own potential Catholic sympathies, but it's not definitive proof.
So the key thing about the lost years is they really are lost.
Pretty much. We have this established family man in Stratford, records of births, marriage, and then this gap. And then suddenly he pops up in London, successful enough to make enemies. How he got from A to B remains a mystery.
Right. And that emergence in London, it wasn't quiet. By 1592, he's not just there, he's making waves. Enough to provoke a really nasty public attack. That's the first concrete sign, isn't it?
It's the absolute smoking gun for his arrival on the scene. The earliest surviving mention we have of him as a playwright in London is this incredibly venomous attack by Robert Greene.
Greene was a rival playwright?
Yes, one of the university wits guys like Marlowe, Peele, Greene himself, who had formal university educations and dominated the London theater scene. Greene wrote this pamphlet, Groat's Worth of Wit, published just after he died in 1592.
And he really lays into Shakespeare.
Oh, it's vicious. He calls Shakespeare an upstart crow beautified with our feathers.
Implying he's stealing their material, or just copying their style.
Both, probably. Accusing him of plagiarism, of being derivative, of riding on the coattails of his educated betters. He also calls him an absolute Johannes factotum.
A jack of all trades, meant as an insult.
Definitely. Like, he can do a bit of everything act, patch up scripts, maybe, but he's not a real artist, not an original genius like them. Greene is basically furious that this actor, this grammar school boy from the provinces, this shake scene, as he puns it, is daring to compete with them and succeeding.
So ironically, Greene's bitterness is our best proof that by 92, Shakespeare was already a significant force.
Exactly. He must have been prolific, popular, and seen as a major competitor for Greene to be that angry and that specific.
Okay, so he survives this attack. How does he go from being the upstart crow to being, well, Shakespeare as we know him? How did he consolidate his position?
The crucial step, really, was moving beyond just being a writer for hire or an actor. It was about business ownership. After about 1594, his plays started being performed exclusively by one company, the Lord Chamberlain's men.
Which became the leading company in London.
Yes. And critically, Shakespeare wasn't just their hired playwright or one of their actors, he was a sharer.
Okay, let's unpack that term, sharer. What did that mean practically? Because it seems key to his success.
It was absolutely key. Being a sharer meant he owned a stake, a share, in the acting company itself. He was a part owner, along with other principal actors like Richard Burbage. This meant he wasn't just paid a flat fee for writing a play, he received a portion of the company's profits from ticket sales, day after day, performance after performance.
Ah, so it gave him financial stability and maybe more creative control.
Both. Huge financial stability compared to writers relying on patrons or selling plays outright. And yes, creative independence. His income was tied to the success of the company playing his works.
So he wasn't living hand to mouth like so many other writers of the time?
Not at all. In fact, most of the surviving legal and financial documents we have about Shakespeare, the things we know for sure relate to his business dealings. Buying property, investing, chasing debts, paying taxes. He was a very savvy businessman.
That's often overlooked, isn't it? We focus on the poet, but he was also a successful entrepreneur.
Very much so. And that business acumen is why he could afford to buy new place, the big house back in Stratford, and eventually retire comfortably.
And the company itself just went from strength to strength, especially after Queen Elizabeth died.
Yes. The transition to King James I in 1603 was a major boost. James loved the theater. He immediately took the Lord Chamberlain's men under his royal patronage, and they became the King's men.
Which meant more prestige, royal performances.
All of that. It gave them unparalleled status, protection, and confirmed their position as the #1 troupe in England.
And this success allowed them to invest in their own theater space. This is where the Globe comes in.
Exactly. The Globe Theatre, built in 1599 on the south bank of the Thames, was a game changer. It was built by the sharers, the actors themselves, for their company.
So they owned the venue.
They owned the building, yes,
Yeah.
or at least the crucial shares in it. This gave them control over their performance schedule, their income, everything. It was a huge step up from renting space in inn-yards or other playhouses.
And later they acquired an indoor theater too, the Blackfriars.
They did in 1608. They took over the lease of the Blackfriars Theatre. This was an indoor venue, smaller, more exclusive, lit by candlelight.
Catering to a different audience, or maybe just winter performances.
Both, really. It allowed them to perform year-round. As the Globe was open air, the Blackfriars attracted a wealthier, more aristocratic audience. They could charge higher prices, and the indoor setting allowed for different kinds of staging, more intimate maybe, more reliant on music and lighting effects. It diversified their business.
It's fascinating how he's juggling this London career, writing, acting, running a business, while still maintaining his life back in Stratford.
Yes, he clearly remained deeply connected to Stratford. Buying new place in 1597 was a major statement. That was the second largest house in town.
And he made other investments there, too.
Oh, yes. In 1605, he made a very substantial investment in local parish tithes, basically, a share in the agricultural taxes collected by the church. It was a safe, long-term, land-based income stream.
Smart move, insulating himself from the ups and downs of the London theater world, like plague closures.
Absolutely. The theaters were closed frequently due to outbreaks of the plague. One estimate suggests they were shut for over 60 months. That's 5 full years spread out between 1603 and 1610. Having secure income from Stratford property and tithes was crucial.
We know he was also acting during this period. Did he play major roles?
The evidence suggests he probably played older, more authoritative roles. Kingly parts, perhaps. The strongest tradition, passed down through theater lore, is that he played the ghost in Hamlet.
Oh, interesting.
And he's listed as one of the principal actors in the first folio edition of his own plays, which confirms he was a significant member of the acting troupe, not just the writer, well into the 1600s. He probably scaled back his acting after about 1605 as his writing career peaked.
And his active career seems to wind down around 1613, and there was a rather dramatic event that year.
Yes, he seems to have effectively retired to Stratford around 1613, spending more time there managing his affairs. And then, in June 1613, the Globe Theatre burned down during a performance of Henry VIII.
How did that happen?
A stage cannon, fired for special effect during the performance, misfired and set the thatched roof ablaze. The whole theater went up in flames very quickly, though apparently no one was seriously hurt.
Did that bankrupt him or the company?
No, the King's men rebuilt the Globe fairly quickly, even grander than before. But the fire, coinciding with his apparent retirement, often feels like a symbolic end to his active London career. Plus, those recurring plague closures likely made the stability and comfort of Stratford increasingly appealing.
Okay, so let's turn to the work itself. The sheer volume and quality are just astounding. Over roughly 2 decades, from maybe 1589 to 1613, he produced this incredible body of work.
It's an astonishing run of creativity, and it's worth remembering collaboration was pretty standard back then. He didn't always write alone.
Right, especially early and late in his career.
Exactly. There's scholarly debate about collaboration on early plays like Titus Andronicus or the Henry VI sequence. And it's certain he collaborated late in his career, most notably with John Fletcher, who succeeded him as the main playwright for The King's Men. Plays like Henry VIII and The Two Noble Kinsmen are generally accepted as collaborations.
Looking at the trajectory, he started off very focused on English history, didn't he?
Yes, the 1590s saw a lot of history plays. Richard III, the three parts of Henry VI, Richard II, King John, then Henry I parts 1 and 2, and Henry V.
What made these so popular?
Well, they drew heavily on well-known historical sources, particularly Holinshed's Chronicles. They dramatized the relatively recent bloody chaos of the Wars of the Roses, which had led to the Tudor dynasty coming to power. So they often had a political dimension, seen as validating the current regime by showing the horrors of civil war that preceded it. And they were just cracking good stories, full of battles, intrigue, and powerful speeches.
And alongside the histories, he was writing comedies.
Yes, his early comedies often show strong classical influences, particularly Roman comedy. The Comedy of Errors, for example, is a direct adaptation of Plautus's Menechmi, full of mistaken identity and farcical situations. The Two Gentlemen of Verona also has that Italianic classical feel.
But then the comedies evolved.
Oh, definitely. By the mid to late 1590s, he hits his stride with the great romantic comedies. A Midsummer Night's Dream, The Merchant of Venice, Much Ado About Nothing, As You Like It, Twelfth Night. These are the plays people often think of first when they hear Shakespearean comedy.
What defines them?
Usually a romantic atmosphere, often set in an idealized world of forest, an Italian court, lots of witty wordplay, clever heroines who often drive the plot, sometimes disguised as men, and a focus on love, courtship, mistaken identity, and ultimately marriage and social harmony.
Though we should probably pause here because some of those comedies contain elements that are, well, difficult for modern audiences.
That's a really important point. We have to engage with the context, but also acknowledge the challenges.
Yeah.
The Merchant of Venice, for example. Shylock is one of Shakespeare's most complex characters, and he gets the famous "hath not a Jew eyes" speech, a powerful plea for shared humanity.
But the play itself relies on and arguably reinforces anti-Semitic stereotypes common in Elizabethan England. It's deeply uncomfortable.
It is. And similarly, The Taming of the Shrew. The whole premise of taming Katharina, culminating in her final speech advocating total wifely obedience. It's often seen as deeply misogynistic today. Modern productions really grapple with how to stage that play, or if they even should.
Right. So after this period of comedies and histories, there's a shift. Around the turn of the century, things get darker. This leads into the great tragedies.
Yes. Roughly from Hamlet, around 1600, 1601, up to about 1608, this is often considered the absolute peak of his artistry. Hamlet, Othello, King Lear, Macbeth, the Big Four, also Antony and Cleopatra and Time in Athens fall in this period.
What links these plays thematically?
Generally, they explore a catastrophic disruption of order, often caused by a fatal flaw or error in judgment within the protagonist. There's usually a sense that the natural, moral, or political order is overturned, leading to widespread suffering and death before some kind of order is often tenuously restored.
And the nature of that fatal flaw varies dramatically.
Hugely. Hamlet is famously about indecision, thought-paralyzing action. But Othello and Lear are almost the opposite tragedies sparked by sudden, rash, terrible judgments. Othello's swift descent into jealous rage, Lear's impulsive division of his kingdom based on flattery.
And Macbeth.
Ambition.
Unchecked ambition, certainly, fueled by supernatural prophecy and his wife's manipulation. It shows how easily ambition can curdle into tyranny and self-destruction, consuming everything around it. They are incredibly powerful explorations of human psychology under extreme pressure.
After this intense, tragic period, his final plays shift tone again, towards the romances. That's right. After about 1608, he writes plays like Pericles, likely a collaboration, Cymbeline, The Winter's Tale, and The Tempest. These are often called romances or tragic comedies.
Why those terms?
Because they blend tragic elements, loss, suffering, apparent death, family separation with comedic endings involving reconciliation, forgiveness, and often miraculous reunions or restorations. The Winter's Tale features a statue coming to life. The Tempest ends with the magician Prospero reconciling with his enemies and freeing his spirit servant.
The Tempest is often seen as his farewell to the stage, isn't it?
It is. Prospero's final speech, where he talks about breaking his staff and drowning his book of magic, is almost universally read as Shakespeare himself taking a bow and stepping away from the theater. These late plays have a graver, more mature tone than the earlier comedies, but they ultimately affirm hope and renewal.
So when these plays were collected after his death in the First Folio, how were they categorized?
The editors of the 1623 First Folio, Heminges and Condell, grouped them very simply: comedies, histories, and tragedies. That was the traditional framework.
But later critics felt that wasn't quite sufficient. Some plays didn't fit neatly.
Exactly. Certain plays seemed to resist easy categorization. They weren't quite comedies, not quite tragedies. In the late 19th century, the critic Frederick S. Boas came up with the term problem plays. This was in 1896.
Problem plays. What makes them problematic? Which ones are they?
The term usually applies to All's Well, That Ends Well, Measure for Measure, and Troilus and Cressida. They're problematic because they deal with difficult, often ambiguous ethical and social issues, and their endings can feel unsatisfying or cynical, not neatly resolving things in the way a typical comedy or tragedy might.
Can you give an example? Measure for Measure.
Measure for Measure is probably the prime example. It tackles things like sexual hypocrisy, abuse of power, the nature of justice versus mercy. The plot involves blackmail, a disguised doof manipulating everyone, and it ends with a series of forced marriages that feel more like punishment than happy resolution. It has comic elements, but the overall tone is dark and questioning. It leaves you with more questions than answers, hence problem play.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, we can't discuss his output without talking about his non-dramatic poetry, especially during those times the theaters were closed.
Right. The plague was actually a catalyst for his published poetic career. When the London theaters were shut down for long periods in 1593 and 1594, he turned to narrative poetry.
And published 2 long poems.
Yes, Venus and Adonis in 1593 and The Rape of Lucrece in 1594. They were hugely popular, much more so initially than his plays, which weren't really considered literature in the same way.
What were they about?
Both are based on classical myths from Ovid. Venus and Adonis is quite erotic, depicting the goddess Venus's obsessive pursuit of the reluctant young hunter Adonis. The Rape of Lucrece is much darker, a tragic poem about the rape of a virtuous Roman wife and its political consequences.
And both were dedicated to the same person.
Yes, both dedicated to Henry Wriothesley, the 3rd Earl of Southampton. He was a young, wealthy, and influential nobleman. These dedications suggest Shakespeare was seeking, and likely received, patronage from him early in his career. These poems really established his reputation as a serious poet, beyond the stage.
And then, much later, came the sonnets, probably his most famous and most personal poetry.
So the sonnets, yes. A sequence of 154 sonnets published together in 1609, quite late in his career, and possibly without his direct authorization.
Unauthorized? How so?
Well, the publisher was Thomas Thorpe, not Shakespeare's usual publisher, and the dedication is famously cryptic. Plus, sonnet sequences were often circulated in manuscript among a private circle before publication. It's possible Thorpe got hold of a manuscript and published it speculatively.
And these sonnets are just extraordinary.
They really are. They're seen as this incredibly profound, complex meditation on love, beauty, desire, time, mortality, betrayal, the whole spectrum of human emotion.
And they seem to fall into 2 main groups, addressed to different people.
Broadly, yes. The first 126 sonnets are mostly addressed to a young man, usually referred to as the fair youth. These explore themes of intense friendship, love, admiration, urging the young man to marry and have children to preserve his beauty, but also dealing with jealousy and disillusionment.
And this fair youth sequence is sometimes interpreted biographically.
Yes, inevitably. The passionate language used has led some critics to argue it reflects Shakespeare's own homoerotic feelings or even a relationship. Others argue it's within the conventions of intense male friendship rhetoric of the period. We simply don't know the identity of the fair youth or the exact nature of the relationship, if it was even based on a real person.
And the second group, the dark lady.
Starting around sonnet 127, the focus shifts to a woman described as having dark hair, dark eyes, and a somewhat promiscuous or faithless nature. These sonnets often explore a more tormented, sexual, and obsessive kind of love, full of self-loathing and bitterness.
So evidence of heterosexual affairs as well.
It certainly seems that way. The language is intensely physical and often quite harsh. Like the fair youth, the dark lady's identity remains unknown, despite endless speculation.
And that dedication in the 1609 quarto to Mr. W.H., Still a mystery.
One of the great literary mysteries. Who was Mr. W.H., the only begetter of the sonnets, as the dedication calls him? Theories abound. William Herbert, Earl of Pembroke, Henry Wriothesley, Earl of Southampton, reversing the initials. Someone else entirely, maybe even the person who procured the manuscript for the publisher.
We just don't know.
We just don't know. And the fact that Shakespeare himself seems to have had no hand in their publication adds another layer of uncertainty. The sonnets offer this incredibly intimate-seeming glimpse into a mind, but the context remains stubbornly elusive.
Let's talk about the language itself, the style. It wasn't static. It evolved dramatically throughout his career. He didn't just use English, he reshaped it.
Absolutely. The stylistic development is one of the most remarkable things about him. If you read an early play like Titus Andronicus or Richard III, the language can feel quite formal, rhetorical, sometimes a bit stiff.
Lots of elaborate metaphors, very patterned speech.
Exactly. You can really see the influence of classical rhetoric, and also earlier English dramatists like Marlowe or Kidd. The verse is often end-stopped, meaning the thought finishes neatly at the end of the line and relies on balanced phrases, antithesis, quite ornate figures of speech. Think of Richard III's opening monologue, "Now is the winter of our discontent." It's powerful, but very structured.
So when did it start to loosen up, become more natural, more psychologically real?
The shift really happens in the mid-1590s. Plays like Romeo and Juliet or Richard II show him developing a much more flexible, organic style. The poetry starts to feel like it's growing directly out of the characters and the dramatic situation, rather than being laid on top.
And his primary tool was blank verse, right? Unrhymed iambic pentameter.
That was the standard, yes. 10 syllables per line, with a pattern of unstressed, followed by stressed syllable, the dum, da dum, da dum, da dum, da dum. It mimics the natural rhythm of English speech, which is why it became the dominant form for English drama.
But just mastering the form wasn't enough for him. He started breaking the rules.
That's the genius of it. He mastered the steady iambic rhythm, and then he started playing with it, varying it, interrupting it to create specific effects. He used run-on lines and jammment, where the sense flows past the end of the line into the next.
So it doesn't sound so rigid.
Exactly. And he used irregular pauses within the line's caesure. He varied the stress patterns, added extra unstressed syllables at the ends of lines, feminine endings. All this makes the verse sound much more like real, spontaneous thought or speech. It can convey hesitation, urgency, emotional turmoil.
You really hear that in the big soliloquies, like in Hamlet. To be or not to be. It feels like someone thinking aloud, wrestling with ideas.
Precisely. The structure of the verse mirrors the movement of the mind. By the time he gets to the great tragedies like Hamlet or Julius Caesar, the blank verse is incredibly supple and powerful, capable of expressing a huge range of psychological states.
And did his style continue to evolve after that in the later plays?
Yes, the late style in plays like Macbeth, Antony and Cleopatra, The Winter's Tale, The Tempest becomes even more distinctive. It's often described as more compressed, dense, even elliptical.
Elliptical, meaning?
Meaning it sometimes leaves things out, jumps between ideas quickly, uses complex, sometimes tangled syntax. The imagery can be incredibly concentrated and rapid fire. You, as the listener or reader, have to work a bit harder to unpack the meaning.
Can you give an example?
Think of Macbeth's lines about pity. Pity, like a naked newborn babe striding the blast, or heaven's cherubim horsed upon the sightless couriers of the air. The images pile up so fast, shifting from a vulnerable baby to powerful angels riding the wind. It's incredibly potent and complex, demanding your full attention.
It's amazing that we even have these words, given how plays were treated back then. This brings us to the textual problem. How reliable are the versions of the plays we read today?
Ah, yes. This is a huge area of scholarship and, frankly, uncertainty. It's crucial to remember that Shakespeare was writing for performance, not publication. Plays weren't considered high literature in the same way poetry was.
So the scripts weren't carefully preserved.
Not always. During his lifetime, about half of his plays were published, usually individually, in cheap printings called quartos. The quality of these quartos varies wildly.
Some were authorized, some weren't.
It seems so. Some quartos, often called good quartos, appear to be based on reliable manuscripts, perhaps Shakespeare's own drafts or official prof copies used in the theater, but others are a mess.
These are the infamous bad quartos.
Exactly. These are texts that seem incredibly garbled and inaccurate compared to later versions. The editors of the first folio, the big collection published in 1623, called these earlier versions stolen and surreptitious copies.
Stolen? How would that even work?
The leading theory is memorial reconstruction. The idea is that maybe some actors, perhaps those playing minor roles, or even audience members, tried to reconstruct the play from memory to sell it to a printer.
So they'd be full of mistakes, paraphrased lines, maybe missing scenes entirely.
Precisely. They give us the distorted version of the play. The bad quarto of Hamlet is famously mangled, with lines that are completely different or nonsensical compared to the good quarto and the folio text.
So the first folio, published by his friends Heminges and Condell 7 years after his death, was meant to fix all this, to give us the definitive texts.
That was clearly the intention. It collected 36 plays, including 18 that had never been printed before. Plays like Macbeth, Julius Caesar, Twelfth Night, The Tempest. Without the first folio, we might have lost those plays entirely, so it's incredibly important.
But even the folio isn't perfect.
No, it has its own errors, omissions, printing mistakes. And sometimes the folio text is significantly different from a seemingly reliable good quarto published earlier.
King Lear is the classic example of this, right? The quarto and folio versions are very different.
King Lear is the most dramatic case. There's a quarto version published in 1608, Q1, and the version in the 1623 folio F. They differ substantially. The folio cuts nearly 300 lines that are in the quarto, including some quite significant passages, like the Fool's Mock Prophecy. But the folio also adds about 100 lines that aren't in the quarto, including some crucial dialogue for Lear himself.
So which one is the real King Lear?
That's the million-dollar question. For a long time, editors tried to create a single conflated text by combining Q and F. But many modern scholars argue that they represent two distinct versions of the play, perhaps revised by Shakespeare himself several years apart.
Maybe one was the original version, and the folio represents a later, perhaps shorter, performance version.
That's a leading theory. The folio version seems arguably more streamlined for performance, perhaps less bleakly philosophical in some ways. Some modern editions, like the Oxford Shakespeare, actually print both versions, arguing that they are distinct works and shouldn't be mashed together.
Wow, so there isn't necessarily one single authoritative text for every play?
Not always. It forces us to accept a degree of textual instability. Shakespeare was a working playwright in a collaborative, dynamic theater environment. Scripts were working documents, subject to revision, cuts, adaptation, maybe even censorship. The textual problem reminds us his primary medium was the living stage, not the fixed page.
Okay, let's track him back to Stratford for his final years. He dies relatively young, aged 52, on April 23, 1616. Do we know much about the circumstances of his death?
Very little for certain. We have that one famous anecdote recorded about 50 years later by John Ward, who became the vicar of Stratford.
The drinking story.
That's the one. Ward wrote in his diary that Shakespeare had recently hosted his fellow writers Michael Drayton and Ben Jonson for a merry meeting where they apparently drank too hard. Ward says Shakespeare contracted a fever afterwards and died from it.
A great story. Plausible.
It's plausible. Ben Jonson was definitely a friend. Whether it's literally true or just local legend, who knows? But it paints a nice picture of him enjoying convivial company right up to the end. Typhus, which could cause a fever, was also common then.
Before he died, though, he made sure his affairs were in order. He signed his will just about a month before his death. And this document, it fuels a lot of speculation, doesn't it? Especially about his wife, Anne.
The will is fascinating, yes. It's a detailed legal document showing he had accumulated a substantial estate property, investments, goods.
And he leaves most of it to his daughter, Susanna.
Yes, the bulk of the estate, including the family home, new place, goes to Susanna and her husband, John Hall. There are careful provisions to ensure it passes down through her line, ideally to male heirs, though she only had a daughter. His other daughter, Judith, received a lesser, though still significant, cash inheritance.
But Anne, his wife of over 30 years, she's barely mentioned.
She's mentioned only once, in an interlineation, meaning it was added in between the lines, possibly as an afterthought. And it's the famous bequest. I give unto my wife my second best bed with the furniture, meaning the bed hangings and linens.
The second best bed. This has caused centuries of debate. What are the main interpretations?
Well, on one side, some scholars argue it wasn't necessarily an insult. Under the law at the time, dower rights, Anne would likely have been automatically entitled to 1/3 of his estate and lifetime residence in New Place anyway, so maybe he didn't need to spell it out in the will.
Okay, so maybe the bed was just a specific item he wanted her to have.
Possibly. The argument goes that the best bed in a prosperous house was often kept in the guest room, a showpiece. The second best bed would have been the marital bed, the one they actually shared. So perhaps it was a sentimental gesture bequeathing her the bed that held personal significance for them.
But the alternative view is it looks like a deliberate slight.
That's the other interpretation, yes. Why mention only that and add it in seemingly late? To leave your wife of decades just the used bed while your daughter gets the bulk of the fortune? It certainly looks cold. It feeds the idea that maybe the marriage wasn't happy, that they lived somewhat separate lives, especially during his London years.
We'll probably never know for sure what he intended.
No, it remains ambiguous. Just like the sonnets, the will gives us this tantalizing personal detail, but leaves the emotional context completely open to interpretation.
And his burial place also has a touch of drama in the Holy Trinity Church in Stratford.
Yes, he was buried in the chancel, the area near the altar, which was an honor reserved for prominent figures. And the stone slab over his grave doesn't just have his name. It has a curse carved on it.
A curse. What does it say?
It's a 4-line verse, basically warning off anyone who might try to move his bones. Good friend, for Jesus' sake forbear to dig the dust enclosed here. Blessed be ye man, and spares these stones, and cursed be he yet moves my bones.
And has anyone ever dared?
Apparently not. The curse seems to have worked. His grave has remained undisturbed for over 400 years, even during church renovations.
Okay, moving beyond his death, we have to address the big cloud of speculation that arose much, much later. The authorship question. The idea that someone else wrote the plays.
Ah, yes, the anti-Stratfordian theories. This really kicked off in the mid-19th century, about 230 years after Shakespeare died.
Why then? What prompted people to start doubting his authorship so long after the fact?
It seems to have been largely fueled by a combination of factors in the Victorian era. One was the rise of bardolatry, that almost religious worship of Shakespeare as a supreme genius. Another was, frankly, social snobbery.
Snobbery? How so?
Many Victorians, particularly those from the upper classes, found it difficult, even impossible, to believe that a man from a relatively humble background, the son of a glover from a provincial town, with only a grammar school education, could have written plays displaying such profound knowledge of law, history, courtly manners, foreign languages, philosophy, falconry, you name it.
They felt the life didn't match the work.
Exactly. They couldn't reconcile the documented life of William Shakespeare of Stratford, the businessman, the property owner, the actor, with the transcendent genius they perceived in the plays and poems. So they started looking for alternative candidates.
And who were the main contenders?
The most prominent early candidates were Sir Francis Bacon, the philosopher, scientist, and courtier, and later Christopher Marlowe, his contemporary playwright, though Marlowe died in 1593, requiring elaborate conspiracy theories. In the 20th century, the strongest claimant became Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, an aristocratic poet and patron of the arts.
The Oxfordian theory is still quite popular in some circles, isn't it?
It is. There are active organizations promoting Oxford and other candidates. They point to supposed coded messages in the plays, parallels between the candidate's life and the plots, and the perceived inadequacy of Shakespeare's known education and experience.
But what's the view of mainstream academia?
The overwhelming consensus among literary historians and Shakespeare scholars is that these are fringe theories. They argue that the historical evidence connected the works to William Shakespeare of Stratford contemporary mentions, legal documents, the testimony of fellow actors like Heminges and Condell in the First Folio is substantial and consistent. They also argue that the doubters underestimate the quality of Elizabethan grammar school education and the accessible knowledge available in London at the time.
So while the debate continues publicly, scholars mostly consider it settled.
For the vast majority, yes. They see the authorship question as more of a cultural phenomenon reflecting changing attitudes towards class and genius, rather than a genuine historical problem.
Another area of ongoing, though perhaps quieter, speculation is his personal religion. Was he a conforming Protestant, or did he have hidden Catholic sympathies?
This is a much more nuanced debate, and there's evidence pointing in both directions. Outwardly, he lived as a member of the established Church of England. He was baptized, married, and buried in the Anglican Church, and his children were too. That was legally required.
But there are hints of Catholicism in his family background.
Yes, definitely. His mother, Mary Arden, came from a prominent Catholic family in Warwickshire, some of whom suffered for their faith. And his father, John Shakespeare, faced fines later in his life for not attending Church of England services.
Was he officially listed as a recusant, someone refusing to conform?
He was listed among those who didn't attend, yes. The official reason given in one document was fear of process for debt, which could be true, as he did have financial troubles later on. However, that specific excuse was also known to be used sometimes by Catholics trying to avoid penalties for non-attendance without openly declaring their recusancy.
And wasn't there some story about a hidden document?
Yes, there's a story about a spiritual testament, a tract affirming Catholic faith, supposedly signed by John Shakespeare, which was allegedly found hidden in the rafters of the Shakespeare family home back in the 18th century. But the document itself is now lost, and its authenticity was debated even then.
So suggestive clues, but nothing definitive about William's own beliefs.
Exactly. Scholars find reflections of both Catholic and Protestant doctrines and debates within the plays themselves. Some argue the plays show a deep understanding of Catholic ideas, purgatory in Hamlet, the role of confession, while others see a fundamentally Protestant worldview. He lived in a time of intense religious conflict and transition, and his works seem to engage with those complexities without necessarily revealing his private allegiance. It remains an open question.
Okay, setting aside the enduring mysteries, let's talk about the legacy. The sheer scale of his influence on, well, everything that came after him, starting with the English language itself, it's immense.
It truly is impossible to overstate. You have to remember, in Elizabethan times, English spelling, grammar, even pronunciation were much less standardized than they are today. They were quite fluid.
And Shakespeare helped fix that.
In a way, yes. By writing with such power, range, and consistency, and by having his works become so widely known and performed, he played a huge role in shaping and standardizing what we now call early modern English. His usage became influential.
Dr. Samuel Johnson certainly thought so.
Absolutely. When Samuel Johnson compiled his groundbreaking dictionary of the English language in 1755, he quoted Shakespeare more often than any other author to illustrate word meanings and usage. Shakespeare's works became a benchmark for the language.
And we still use phrases he coined every single day, often without even realizing it.
Hundreds of them. It's incredible. Things like, with bated breath from The Merchant of Venice, a foregone conclusion from Othello, break the ice from Tammy and the Shrew, wild goose chase from Romeo and Juliet, all that glitters is not gold, though the exact phrasing varies slightly, from Merchant of Venice.
Buzz blind.
Merchant of Venice again. Wear your heart on your sleeve from Othello. He also seems to have introduced many words into the written record for the first time, or at least popularized them. Words like eyeball, downstairs, lackluster, lonely, majestic, excellent, critical.
So he wasn't just using the language, he was actively expanding its vocabulary and toolkit.
He really was. He saw where English needed new ways to express ideas or nuances, and he either invented words or adapted existing ones. He permanently enriched the expressive capacity of the language.
And beyond language, his impact on literature, on storytelling itself, is just as profound.
Fundamentally so. He pushed the boundaries of what drama could do, especially in terms of characterization. His ability to create complex, psychologically believable characters full of contradictions and inner life was revolutionary.
Influencing novelists centuries later.
Absolutely. Think of 19th century novelists like Charles Dickens or Herman Melville. Dickens' incredible gallery of vivid, often grotesque or eccentric characters owes a huge debt to Shakespearean archetypes, especially from the comedies and histories. And Melville explicitly drew on Shakespearean tragedy for Moby Dick. Captain Ahab is essentially a classic tragic hero in the mold of King Lear or Macbeth, consumed by his obsession.
And his influence extends into music, too, doesn't it? Opera especially seems drawn to his plots.
Oh, enormously. It's estimated there are over 20,000 pieces of music inspired by Shakespeare's works. Opera composers, in particular, found his stories irresistible. Giuseppe Verdi was obsessed with Shakespeare.
He wrote 3 Shakespearean operas.
3 absolute masterpieces: Macbeth, then late in his career, Othello, and Falstaff. They are considered among the greatest operas ever written, powerful musical translations of the plays. And you have others like Gounod's Romeo et Juliet, Nicolai's The Merry Wives of Windsor, Britten's A Midsummer Night's Dream.
And orchestral music, too. Mendelssohn.
Felix Mendelssohn's music for A Midsummer Night's Dream, written when he was just a teenager, including the incredibly famous Wedding March, is a cornerstone of the classical repertoire. Prokofiev's ballet Romeo and Juliet, Tchaikovsky's fantasy overture of the same name. The list goes on and on.
It's also striking how adaptable his stories are. They translate not just across art forms, but across cultures and time periods, especially in film.
That really speaks to the universality of the core human dramas he explored. Film directors have constantly returned to him. You mentioned Kurosawa earlier.
Akira Kurosawa, the great Japanese director, his Throne of Blood is Macbeth set in feudal Japan, and Ran is King Lear.
And they work brilliantly. The power struggles, the ambition, the family dynamics, they translate perfectly into that samurai context.
Yeah.
Or think of Orson Welles, who was steeped in Shakespeare his whole life. He adapted several plays and considered his film Chimes at Midnight, which focuses on the character of Falstaff from the Henry IV plays, to be his best work.
There are modern adaptations, too, like Baz Luhrmann's Romeo plus Juliet or countless versions of Hamlet.
Exactly. His plays provide these incredibly robust narrative structures and complex characters that filmmakers can reinterpret endlessly for new audiences and contexts. Even fields outside the arts were influenced. Sigmund Freud, for instance, famously drew on Hamlet when developing his theories about the Oedipus complex in human psychology.
So his critical reputation, has it always been this high? Or did it dip at any point?
It's been remarkably high, pretty much from the start. His own contemporaries recognize his genius. Ben Jonson, who could be quite critical, wrote that amazing tribute in the first folio.
Calling him soul of the age, and not of an age, but for all time.
Exactly. That set the tone. While tastes changed the Restoration period, adapted his plays heavily, the early 18th century sometimes found him a bit unrefined. His reputation grew steadily. Voltaire introduced him to France. Goethe championed him in Germany.
And then the Romantics and Victorians really elevated him.
That's when bardolatry set in that intense, almost uncritical worship. Critics like Coleridge and Hazlitt explored the psychological depth of his characters. Victor Hugo called him one of the great poet-prophets of humanity.
George Bernard Shaw famously tried to knock him off his pedestal a bit.
Shaw did, yes. He admired Shakespeare, but also felt the bardolatry was excessive and sometimes hindered modern drama. But even Shaw couldn't diminish his stature overall.
And the modern view, people like Harold Bloom.
Leading critics like Harold Bloom argue that Shakespeare's influence is so pervasive, he practically invented our modern conception of human personality and interiority. Bloom famously wrote, "Shakespeare was larger than Plato and then St. Augustine. He encloses us because we see with his fundamental perceptions."
Oh, he encloses us. That's a powerful claim.
It is. It reflects the sense that his understanding of human nature was so profound and comprehensive that it shaped how we've understood ourselves ever since, and that universality helps explain his unparalleled global reach.
The best-selling playwright ever, translated into over 80 languages.
More than 4 billion copies sold, as we mentioned. Translated into everything from major world languages to constructed languages like Klingon and Esperanto, you can find Shakespeare being performed and studied in almost every country on Earth, from, say, a Hamlet in Lithuanian to The Merchant of Venice in Hebrew. It's a truly global phenomenon. So we've covered a lot of ground, the life we can piece together, the business side, the revolutionary way he used language, the enduring mysteries. But maybe the question to leave you with, to really think about, is why? Why does this writer, using early modern English from over 400 years ago, writing about Elizabethan politics, Roman generals, Danish princes, why does he still connect so powerfully across centuries, across cultures, from, Tokyo to Toronto, Lagos to Los Angeles? It's not just the poetry, is it?
No, it has to be something deeper, the humanity he captured. The fundamental conflicts and desires that don't really change. And maybe that's the real tension to ponder. You have scholars meticulously trying to pin down his original words, sorting through quartos and folios. And at the same time, you have this explosion of creative freedom around the world, people taking his stories and making them entirely their own, in their own cultures, their own languages, that ongoing dialogue, that constant reinterpretation. Maybe that's the clearest sign of his truly universal and living genius. Definitely something to explore further on your own.